3 years ago, I came to Harvester because a friend of mine told me about Journey to Bethlehem, and I told her I wasn't religious. I told her it wasn't really my thing. I'm not really a churchgoer, and it was an experience, you know, the camels and sheep and people in the woods and everything that they had. I probably waited a week or two, maybe 3, and then I decided to come check out a service. And the very first service that I came to, our worship leader, Brad Streeter, he did a worship song, and then he had his wife come up on stage, and they decided to talk about losing their son, Louis. I just couldn't believe he was being so vulnerable, so open, you know, like the courage that he and Courtney had to just share their story with a room of like, I don't know, 800 strangers. It was just, it was mind-boggling to me. That's when I kind of looked around and I thought, like, this place is special, so I should keep coming. And I actually met Brad and some people on the worship team and told them that I play drums, and they said that they do need another drummer, but being where I am, like, I wasn't religious. I wasn't sure where I was in my walk with God or with Jesus. I think I spent most of my life pretty angry. I always just kind of shied away from churches and religion. Fast forward to February 2021. I had gone through a pretty tough breakup, well, an extremely tough breakup, and just kind of felt like I was hitting rock bottom. And I got an email from Brad that said, "Can you play drums next Sunday?" And I looked at that email and I was like, no way. Like, there's no way I can go to church. And Brad finally texted me and was like, "Hey, let me know if you can play on Sunday." And I told him I'm having a really hard time. I don't know if I can. And so he had just recommended that I come in and I play. And so I was like, okay. And it was the last song of the service. I remember just the lyrics and everything just really connecting with me while I was playing. And I just started sobbing. And so while I was crying, I remember leaning over and I was trying to play, and my vision was blurry because of my tears, and my tears were dropping on my drum. And I remember after that song that I just needed some time alone. I made a beeline for the stairwell, and everyone else went to the green room. And I remember reaching for the door handle, and Brad tapped me on the back. Whew. And he was just like, "Will you walk with me for a second?" And I was like, "Not right now." Like, now's not a good time. And so he said, just come walk with me. And so I walked with him, and I remember him pulling me aside and just giving me a hug and just telling me that God loves me. And I remember, like, I started to lose feeling in my legs. Like, I started to kind of lose the strength in my legs, and I told him I have to sit down or lay down or something. And so I just went down to my knees and just kind of laid on the floor. And I just kind of closed my eyes, and I remember kind of having this vision. I was in like a dark room, and I remember like a brick in my vision. I remember a brick falling and like light shining through the brick, and then another brick falling and another one, and then they all end up falling. And all that was left was just like this light, this warmth. And I just remember feeling safe. So having all of these feelings and going through this, I didn't know what to do next. So I talked with Brad a lot. I met with Doyle a lot. And kind of the next step in my journey was I wanted to get baptized. So Brad and Doyle both baptized me. When they put me in the water and pulled me out, it was silent for a second, and I just felt like, just like a weight was lifted off my shoulder. It's that resurrection, it's that second chance, it's that I'm so glad it happened to me now. You know, like, what's the saying? Like, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. And so I'm so glad I found this now compared to down the road.
Man, I'll tell you, I love a good resurrection story. I love seeing how Jesus is interacting with people's spirits and souls right here at Harvester Christian Church. I know many of you have experienced that same thing that Jeremy's experienced, where Jesus just gets a hold of you and then he pulls you in at these moments that were unexpected. Next week, we're going to have one of those moments where we're going to get to watch as people get to experience what Jeremy got to experience, and that's the grace of Jesus falling down on you to the point where you just have to let go and let God. And so next week, we've got a baptism weekend where if you've never experienced that, man, I hope you'll come ready to experience what Jeremy got to experience, what I've experienced, and what so many people here have experienced as well. This has been a great series. I hope that you've been learning a lot from 1 Corinthians 15. We're in a series that we're calling Rise Up. And I'll tell you, when we were talking about this series in the chapter, we knew that there was a lot to it. There was a weight to it. And so we wanted to put some imagery to it to help it to make a little bit more sense. And baptism was one of those images that just makes sense. Scripturally, it makes sense when you're talking about rising up. Baptism is a great metaphor for that rising up. And so that's the image we landed on. We thought about using the image of a seed. In the passage that we're going to look at today, there's this metaphor of a seed that goes into the ground and then it rises up as a plant. We thought about using that. I actually recommended like this picture of a hand coming out of the ground, like a zombie hand, like bloody. Because when I think of rise up, I think of Walking Dead. That's what I think of. I think of zombies, I'm like just rising up from the ground. Harvester, these dead corpses coming out of our church building. That's what I want for our city. That got vetoed really quickly. The creative arts team wasn't on for that. But maybe you're like me and that's what you think of. When you think of life after death, a lot of people, they think of those kinds of images. In fact, that's the image that our culture gives to life after death. Just a few images from culture. This is one. It's the zombie image. That's what we think of, life after death, right? A lot of people in our society and our culture think, okay, if there is life after death, then it's just like our dead bodies that come out of the grave. But there's really no soul there. There's no spirit there. Really, all it is resuscitated death. In fact, you were better beforehand. There was more life before you died, but life after death is just this body, decayed and ugly, coming out of the grave. That's how some people think of life after death. Other people think of it like this. They think of it as a ghost. Well, okay, if it's not the body that comes out, maybe the body just stays in the grave, and it's just this smoky, creepy soul that comes out of the grave, and it's a spirit that haunts all of your exes from high school. That's what life after death is, where you can just go haunt and scare people. For other people, it's not a ghost, but they're like, life after death looks like this. It's an angel where you come back and you're like part human and part duck. And you get wings and you can just, wah, wah. Heaven's great, wah, wah. Get some insurance. Some people think you just turn into an angel. Other people, other religions, it's more reincarnation. They would say, if you die, then you come back as another human or a baby if you were good. If you're bad, you come back as a cockroach. And that's what life after death is. It's one of the other or something in between. And I'll tell you this, Christianity has a different view of life after death than the culture presents to us. It's not a zombie. It's not a ghost. It's not that we turn into angels. It's not that we're reincarnated for a second chance at everything that happens today. For Christianity, there's this belief that there's an end that's coming. In fact, we talked about that last week where Paul says that the end is coming, and in the end, Jesus will deliver the kingdom that he reigns over. He'll deliver that back to God. Now, when he comes, Jesus comes as the resurrected Jesus. He says that's the important part of the gospel is that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and it was a physical resurrection. And so it's going to be the physical resurrected Jesus that returns. And when he turns, what Christianity teaches is that he returns, and then those who have died in the faith, those who died believing in Jesus, having this relationship with Jesus, then they rise from the dead. Not as zombies, not as ghosts, not as angels, but we rise as resurrected people with resurrected bodies that live in that kingdom with Jesus forever. Now, the natural question, and we're going to explore this question today, is this. Well, what kind of body will rise up? What kind of body rises up from the dead? I think you would have that question. The Corinthians, they had that question. So open up your Bibles, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We're about halfway through this now, and it's in verse 35, where Paul begins to present that question that the Corinthians are asking. Starting in verse 35, it says this. Paul's saying, someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You foolish person. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. He begins to switch this to this metaphor of a seed that's being planted in the ground. He says, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but it's a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. He's saying you've got to rethink about how you think about life after death. If we're going to ask the question, what kind of body raises up? First, we have to rethink about the way that we think about life after death. The Corinthian assumption was that, this life right now is the best there is. In their mind, life precedes death. Life precedes death. And in some of your mind, that's the way you think too, that life precedes death, which means there's life, and then you die, and then there's really not much else after that. Or if there is something else, it's not something worth longing for. So we long for this life. We long to make this life as good as we can make it and as grand as we can make it. But Paul is like, that's a foolish way to think of the world. It's a foolish way to think of life. For Paul, life doesn't precede death. Life comes after it. Life is the next thing that comes. That yes, we are alive now, but man, the life we're going to experience after the seed has been planted, that's the life that Paul is pointing towards. The Corinthians, if they were to view life in a agricultural metaphor, maybe they would view life not as a seed, but as a leaf. Like a leaf. One of my favorite things about St. Louis's fall weather, by the way, I love riding my motorcycle down Highway 94 and seeing all the leaves and all the color and watching the greens turn to like these bright and vibrant reds, and it's beautiful. But then what comes next? Winter, where the leaves fall off onto the ground into your yards, and it's just a lot of ugliness and pain that comes next. Those leaves, for most of us who don't rake our lawns, they go into the ground, they get buried into the mud, and what happens to them then? They decay and they die. If you were to go try to dig up a leaf and hold it in your hand, the beauty's not there anymore. It's not beautiful, it's dead, it's decayed. And a lot of the Corinthians and a lot of us view life that way. That this is our moment to shine. This is our moment to be in all of our splendor and all of our beauty. I just want to live my best life now, right? That's what everybody thinks, like this is my best life now, and then comes death, then we're in the ground and we decay in the ground. Paul, for him, he's like, this is the metaphor of Jesus. Not that you're a leaf that goes into a ground, but you're the seed that falls to the ground. And that seed goes into the ground, and winter comes and goes, and then spring comes, and then what happens? That's when the seed gets to experience its true beauty. That's when it gets to experience its growth. That's when it gets to experience its life. After the seed dies, then life comes next after death. And for Paul, that's real life. That's real beauty. And it's only discovered after the death, after it falls to the ground. Your view of life makes a difference how you approach your life. I was talking to one of our staff members this week. We were talking about the resurrection and 1 Corinthians 15. And one of the questions that she said that her and her husband just had conversations about just over the last few years is about the child that they had lost at birth. They lost a child at birth, and when it comes to the resurrection, she said their conversation was always like, when we get to meet him in that resurrected kingdom, who are we going to meet? It's going to be a baby? It's going to be a teenager or adult? Like what does that body look like when it rises? And I'll tell you, the way that you view life matters, because if you view life like a leaf, that this life is the beauty and the fullness of it, then when death comes, what comes next is not beauty, it's death. But if life is a seed, And this is what I was telling her. I'm like, the scriptures don't tell us in that scenario what happens and who you actually get to interact, but it does tell us that you get to meet that person and they are resurrected. And if our lives are seeds, then I got to imagine that when a seed is planted into a ground, what happens to a seed? It grows to full maturity. Like that moment when the tree's branches are spread the widest. It's at its most mature. It's at its most glorious splendor. It's at its most beauty. That moment where the leaves are just vibrant and colorful. That moment before fall begins to set in. Like that's what I think we're going to meet. That's the resurrected body that I think we're going to meet. Not just the sapling, but the full-grown, beautiful, mature person. And I'll tell you this, your view of life makes a difference how you approach this world, especially how you approach death in this world. Is this life the best there is? Or is the best yet to come? If life is a leaf, then once autumn comes, that's the end. But the hope of Christianity is that life is a seed, and after autumn comes winter, after winter comes spring, and when spring comes, what has fallen to the ground rises up in beautiful splendor and in beauty unimaginable. So that still begs the question, well, what kind of body will rise up? What kind of body will we have? What kind of body is going to come from the grave? And so after presenting that little metaphor, Paul goes on to give us two answers. First one he gives us is a theological answer to what kind of body rises up. And then he gives us a pragmatic answer. Here's the theological answer that he gives us. And it's actually really posed as a question. I want to pose it as a question. If you're going to ask the question, what kind of body will we have? I think a question you need to ask now is, what kind of God do we have? If you want to understand what kind of body will we have in the future, a great question to ask is, what kind of God do we have right now? What kind of God is he? And if you want to know what the kind of that body is, you've got to ask that question. Paul asked that question in verse 38 to 41. He presents the kind of God that we have. He says this. He says, God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans and another for animals. Paul begins to name all these different creatures that God has created throughout creation. He says there's one for humans, animals, another for birds, another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly one is a kind and the glory of the earthly is of another. There is one glory of the sun, of the moon, another glory of the stars, for stars differ from stars in their glory. Essentially what Paul is doing is he's saying, if we're going to talk about the kind of bodies that God's going to give us in the future, let's look at what kind of God we have. And let's look at God in the past, when he's dealt with creation and when he's made things. And Paul actually goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And he points us back there. He says, you remember when God created the fish and the animals and the birds, and he created the sun and the moon and the stars? He created those each according to their kind. Like God created them separately. They all have their own individual beings and own individual materials. And then after he created them, what did God call them? For those of you Bible scholars in the room, in Genesis 1, he created and then he called it good. He would make the moon and the stars and he'd be like, that's good, I love it. The bear, oh, good bear. Like that's a really good, hey bear, you're good. I made you that way. Or hey cat, or hey dog, or hey tree, or hey fish. He would create these things and then he would call them good, which means this: he really liked them. He liked what he created. And if that's the case, then what Paul is telling us is God likes what he created. He's not really interested in destroying them and starting over from scratch. A lot of people think that's what God wants to do, is the future body, the future creation. He wants to destroy it, to remove it, and start over from scratch. For Paul, if we're going to ask the question, what kind of God do we have? This is how he'd answer it. We have a creative God. We have a God who has created all things. We have a God who loves uniqueness. We have a God who creates in the physical realm, even though he's not physical. Like God could create things that weren't physical, but for some reason when he created the universe, he creates with material. He creates in the physical realm. And he loves what he creates. He calls it good. which means that he's not planning to discard it. He's not planning to destroy it. But what he does do is he plans to recreate it, to reform it, and then to make them good again. Paul's view is that our resurrected bodies will be a continuation of what God has created, not a replacement. Our resurrected bodies will be a continuation of our current bodies, but also not just a continuation, but a transformation, a recreation of them to make them good again. Some people believe that, that all God wants to do is that he wants to take your body, he wants to remove the spirit from it, discard your body, and just keep the spirit. That's what he really wanted. He wants to do that. He wants us to be spirits or ghosts living on some ethereal cloud heaven forever. But if we have a God who creates beautiful things, he's not going to discard his creation. He's going to recreate them and transform them. And this continuation of what is will be better than what was, which means what's coming is better than what we currently have and what we had before. But that still begs the question, doesn't it? Well, what kind of body will we have? Okay, if that's the case, if it's going to be this, but it's not going to be this, like what kind of body will we actually have? That's where Paul goes on and he gives the practical answer. What kind of body, what will our resurrected bodies look like? At this point in the sermon, I told my wife, I should just take my shirt off and just show them what a resurrected body looks like. That's what I should do. She disagreed with that. She's like, that is not a glorified body. So what I want to do is I just want to share what Paul says. I want to read, in this next bit of scripture, he gives 4 descriptions of what the resurrected body looks like. It looks nothing like this. So you can get this out of your mind, okay? Stop looking at me. Don't look at me when I read this next part. All right. 1 Corinthians 15, starting with verse 42, goes on to say this. He gives 4 descriptions. He says, so it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. He's going to give us 4 descriptions. First one is, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown in natural body, so it goes into the ground. It's sown like a seed, a natural body, but it's raised a spiritual body. It's imperishable, it's raised in glory, it's raised in power, and it's raised a spiritual body. So what kind of body will we have? What kind of body, resurrection body, will rise up? He gives us 4 descriptions, and what I want to do is I want to look at them backwards from what he said. And so he said that there's imperishable in glory, it's raised in power and spiritual body. But I want to start with the last one that he mentions because this one really forms the idea and the mentality for the other 3. And so for Paul, when he's looking at the resurrected body, he says this, what rises up will be a spiritual body, not a natural body. What rises up will be a spiritual body, not a natural body. Now, I know what most of you are thinking. Well, doesn't that mean he's going to get rid of the natural body and we're going to be spirits? That's the natural reading of this. We're like, it's just we're going to be spirits, but that's not what he's emphasizing. Paul is not remarking on what the body is made of. He's remarking on what powers the body, what animates the body. A good way to think of it is to think of it in the realm of like cars or vehicles, right? We have gas-powered cars and electric cars. We have gas cars and electric cars. They're both cars. They're both made of the same materials, plastic and metal, right? But they're powered by something different. One's powered by gas, one's powered by electric. And what Paul is remarking on is that this natural body and the spiritual body, it's not that it's made of different materials, like one's flesh and blood and one is this smoky ghost substance. They're both flesh and blood, they're both bodies, but one is powered by the natural body. It's that normal life that keeps us alive. It's that normal beating of our hearts. It's that breathing of our lungs. That's where our life is coming from. But our resurrected bodies, though made of the same flesh and blood, will be powered by something completely different. The Spirit of God. The Spirit of God will be the life that sustains us, informs us, and keeps us going. And it's a spirit that we have access to now, but too often we lean into the natural life. Paul, he talks about this struggle in Romans chapter 7. If you've read that chapter, it's a really confusing chapter because you can see his frustration. For Paul, he's talking about his own natural body and how he wants to live by the Spirit, but there's this nature part of him that keeps him doing things he doesn't want to do. And in Romans 7, he's like, there's these things that I want to do and I should be doing, but I don't do them. And then there's these things that I don't want to do and I'm ashamed of, but I keep doing them. And he says, the good I want to do, I don't do. The bad that I don't want to do, I do. And he says, that's the flesh living in me. That's nature inside of me. And Paul, he's talking about this struggle, and he's saying, like, right now my brain is making these horrible decisions. It's leading me down this horrible path. It's fueled by this fleshly desire. My body is fueled by my sin. My body is fueled by lust. My body is fueled by cravings. My body is fueled by this need for power and control. But one day, my flesh will not be in power. There's coming a day in our resurrected bodies where we will be powered by something different. God's Spirit will power us. Which means this, church, and I think this is good news, that the good that you want to do today, in your resurrected body, you will be able to do every single time. How about that? How about that? Here's what I know about you. There's this thing inside of you that desires to do good, desires to speak well of people, desires to leave the addiction, leave those struggles behind, but there's something pulling you back into it. And Paul's like, there's coming a day when the nature is not going to determine what happens in our bodies and through our bodies, but it's the Spirit of God. And so that bad that you don't want to do, you won't do it. That good that you want to do, you will do it because you're powered by something else. You're animated by something else, the Spirit of God. He goes on and says a second description here is in power, that we will be raised in power, and he differentiates it from weakness. Now, we get this one, right? I mean, how many of you rolled out of bed today in weakness, not in power? I'm getting a little bit older. I don't know if you've noticed my hair is whitening a little bit more and more every time I stand up here. My bones are also creaking a little bit more. I'm starting to think maybe I need a different pillow because I wake up with my neck messed up. And like our bodies and these bodies, this natural body that we have, we got a lot of struggles in these bodies. There's this weakness that defines them. There's exhaustion. Anybody tired of being exhausted? Like tired of being tired throughout the week? It's like this body just can't get enough energy. It can't get enough go to it. And we get to the end of the week and we're just exhausted from it. You know, in the book of Genesis, it says that when Adam and Eve sinned, the curse that was put on them was a curse of weakness in their body, right? You remember that? There was the curse of pain in childbirth, and there was the curse of just exhaustion from working. What Paul is saying, in our resurrected bodies, those curses are removed. They're gone. They're dealt with, and they're a thing of the past because no longer are our bodies created in weakness, but we rise in power. Man, imagine getting out of your bed every single day in power. Like your body is just like, it's fresh and it's ready to go. There's no pain, there's no exhaustion. You can go about your daily task. You can play with your kid on the floor. You can have conversation with your spouse, and there's just this energy that you have. That's an energy found in our resurrected bodies. Paul goes on to list another one. He says that we will be raised in glory, not in dishonor. Raised in glory, not in dishonor. Now, this word glory, it's a word for like shine. It's a word for brightness. It's a word often used of God. There's a story in the Old Testament where Moses, he gets to stand in front of God face to face in all of God's glory, and there's this shine, there's this light, there's this brightness, to the point where Moses, he walks down the mountain and it says his face is shining because he's experienced the Shekinah glory of God. Now, what Paul's not saying here, he's not saying that when we rise from the dead, we are going to be like lightning bugs. We're going to be like glowing creatures. We're going to be our own little night lights. What he's emphasizing here is that the light he's talking about is that our bodies will be raised in glory, which means there will be no darkness in it. Darkness in it, or what he would call dishonor. I mean, how many of you are tired of the darkness that's in your mind? How many of you struggle with that? There's this something in there that you just can't rid yourself of. There's this anxiety, there's this worry, there's this depression, and there's this shame that you have from it. How many of you stand in front of a mirror and you don't experience glory, you experience dishonor, you experience shame or humiliation, and you try to cover up, you try to make up, you try to change and get the best clothes to hide what's under it. There's this shame and there's this dishonor that we have. I mean, that was the result of Adam and Eve's shame, or Adam and Eve's sin, wasn't it? What's the very first thing that they did when they found out they sinned? There was this dishonor that they had of their bodies. They sinned, and it says their eyes were open, and the first thing they saw was their nakedness, and they were ashamed, and they try to hide. And Paul says, man, when we're resurrected, I don't know if he's saying we're going to be naked or not. I don't know what he's talking about there, but I hope not. But here's what I do know he's saying, that your bodies are going to have a glory, not a dishonor. That it's going to lack that darkness. It's going to be, that shame is going to be removed. That humiliation is going to be removed. There's not going to be this sense that I've got to hide myself from my loved ones. I have to hide myself from strangers. I have to hide myself from God. We'll be raised in glory. And then he also says, one of his descriptions of the resurrected body is that it will be raised imperishable. Imperishable, which means it won't perish. Now, what I love about this is you look at these few, and it's almost like it's a resurrection of the inner person, that it's that thing that's happening in your brain or in your heart or on the inside of you. But we get here, and it's not just a resurrection of the inside, but it's a resurrection of the outside as well. I mean, if you use that car metaphor, imagine having a fuel that you can put in your car, and it doesn't just preserve the engine, but it preserves the bodywork as well. Who would buy that fuel? Where every time you put gas in it, like your truck is not gonna rust anymore. Like it will never scratch, it will never dent. You can drive that thing for decades because the engine's gonna be good, but the bodywork is gonna be good as well. And that's what Paul tells us of the Spirit. And when we have these bodies that are powered by the Spirit, it powers us on the inside and it preserves us on the outside. That it's not a body that's gonna be prone to decay. It's not a body that it's gonna be prone to disability. It's not a body that's gonna be prone to death. It's not just an inside renewal, it's an outside renewal as well. You know, ultimately, I think the picture that we get that Paul presents here of the body is that what the resurrected body is gonna look like is what you see in the mirror. That's what it's gonna look like. It's gonna be flesh and blood. We're gonna be each the people that we are. Theologians call it identifiable different. We're gonna be identifiably us, but different. We're gonna be a continuation of us, but transformed. Transformed in a really unique way. I mean, imagine looking into the mirror and seeing yourself in the mirror. Paul says that's what the resurrection body is gonna look like. But it's that minus the weaknesses that you see in the mirror today. Minus the dishonor that you feel when you look in the mirror today. Minus the shame, minus the temptation, minus the drive driven by addiction and lust, minus decay, minus disability, minus death. I really believe that our bodies are going to be the greatest testimony in all of creation that Jesus Christ is Lord over sin and death. I mean, that's going to be the testimony. I mean, imagine looking at yourself and being like, Jesus, you remove my sin from the mirror? I don't see it there anymore. I don't feel the guilt anymore. I don't feel the shame anymore. Jesus, you removed death and blemish. I don't see it anymore. And Jesus looks back at you and says, that's the kind of God that I am. A God who was crucified on the cross gave up his body, his physical body, so that we can experience a physical resurrection. Anybody in the room tired of cancer? Sick of cancer? Sick of heart disease? Anybody sick of disability, of diabetes, of decay? When the body rises up in strength, not weakness. Anybody tired of looking in the mirror and feeling shame? When the body rises up, it rises up in glory, not in dishonor. Anybody tired of the natural body getting a say over what you do today? Anybody tired of your addiction getting an opinion on what you eat or drink today? Anybody tired of the anger flaring up and determining how you live in the relationships that you live in today? At the resurrection, it's not the nature, it's not the flesh that powers us. It's the Spirit of God. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead lives inside of you, and it's got a work prepared for you. And I'll tell you, that to me is so much more attractive than being a disembodied ghost on some cloud somewhere forever. But the question is, and this is just the final question I want to pose to you, is like, what do you do about that today? Because that's then, right? That's at the resurrection. But I know what sits in the chair today is not power, not glory, not strength. For many of you, what sits in the chair today is you feel that weakness, you feel that dishonor, you feel that shame, you feel that nature that's leading. So what do we do today? Here's what you do today. You put that body in the hands of a risen Lord. That's what you do today. You take all of that shame, all that dishonor, all of that pain, all of that weakness, all of that addiction, all of that natural drive, and you take that and you put it in the hands of a resurrected Lord who has defeated death, who has claimed victory over all of creation, who now reigns above it all. And you look at him and his life and his body, and you believe the promise that someday he's coming back, resurrected himself to resurrect your body as well. Amen, church?